vanished. Picture the place your own spiritual tradition was born, whatever that tradition is. Now imagine going back and finding it almost gone. There's a version of tonight's story you've probably heard. An army came, a library burned. Buddhism ended in India. That version isn't wrong exactly, but it explains almost nothing. Because Buddhism did not die in an afternoon. It faded over roughly 600 years in the country that built it. And the armies arrived at the end of that process, not the beginning. By the time horsemen reached the gates of the great monasteries, most of what had sustained Buddhism in India for 1,000 years was already gone. So tonight, how Buddhism vanished from the land where it was born, and how, in the autumn of 1956, a man who had helped write India's constitution stood in a field in Nagpur and brought it back. But before any of that, one conversation from the Pāla canon, the Buddha's senior disciple, Mahakassapa, comes to him with a question that sounds like it belongs to a much later century. Why are there now more rules than there used to be, he asks, and fewer people who actually reach awakening? SN Sen 1613. The Buddha's answer is not the one you would expect, and it describes what happened in India with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. Chapter 1. To understand a disappearance, you first have to understand what was there. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, an emperor named Ashoka ruled almost the entire Indian subcontinent. He had taken it the ordinary way, with an army and with a war in Kalinga so brutal that, by his own later account carved into rock, something in him broke over it. He turned to the Buddha's teaching, and then he did something that almost no ruler in history has done with a religion he actually believed in. He gave it away. He sent monks outward, to Sri Lanka, to the Greek-ruled kingdoms in the northwest, toward Central Asia, and eventually onto the trade roads that carried the teaching into China. He had the Dhamma cut into stone pillars in a language ordinary people could read. He made Buddhism a state-supported tradition inside India and an export at the same time. Hold on to that too. It is going to matter enormously at the end of tonight. For the next 1,000 years, India was not a center of the Buddhist world. It was the center. Everything else was downstream. Chinese pilgrims did not travel to Tibet to learn. They walked across deserts and mountain passes for years at genuine risk of death to get to Bihar, because that was where the books were, and the teachers, and the ground the Buddha had actually walked on. And then, over the following 6 centuries, it emptied out. One clarification before we go further, because the word in tonight's title is doing a lot of work. Vanished is true of the Indian heartland, the Gangetic Plain, Bihar, Bengal, the places where the Buddha taught. It is not true of all of India. In Ladakh, in Sikkim, in what is now Arunachal Pradesh, Buddhist communities have practiced continuously, without a break, into the present day. So have the Baruas of eastern Bengal and the Chittagong region, over 1 million people whose Buddhism was never interrupted at all. They were never part of the vanishing. Keep them in the frame, because almost every version of this story forgets them. Now, the height. Somewhere around the 2nd century of the Common Era, a philosopher named Nagarjuna produced the argument that would reshape Buddhist thought for the next 1800 years. 200 years after that, the brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu built the great systematic psychology of the tradition, an analysis of how consciousness constructs its own world, written 1.5 millennium before anyone in Europe attempted anything comparable. And around the year 427, Under the Gupta emperors, a monastery was founded in Bihar called Nalanda. Calling Nalanda a monastery undersells it in a way that matters. Our best-known description comes from the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who arrived in the 7th century and stayed for years. By his account, Nalanda held around 8,500 students and roughly 1,500 teachers. Those are his numbers, and it is worth saying that modern scholars treat them as generous. Some archaeological estimates put the resident population closer to 4,000. Either way, the scale is extraordinary for the 7th century anywhere on Earth. But the number that tells you the most isn't the enrollment, it's the admission rate. Xuanzang describes an oral examination at the gate. A guard, himself a scholar, questioned arrivals before they were allowed in. 7 or 8 out of every 10 were turned away. This was not a place you joined by showing up in robes. It was a place with an entrance exam, run by a doorman who could out-argue you. And what you studied there was not only Buddhism. The curriculum ran through logic, Sanskrit grammar, medicine, mathematics, and the philosophical systems of Nalanda's opponents, because you were expected to be able to defeat them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Yi Jing, arrived in 673 and stayed about a decade, and left us the most detailed account we have of how the days were actually organized. So, not a retreat center. Closer to a residential research university, 800 years before Oxford, with an admissions bar, a faculty, an international student body, and a library complex that the entire Buddhist world depended on. That is what disappeared. Now the harder question: how? Here is where most tellings of this story go wrong, and where the real answer is sitting in plain sight. In the paperwork, by the 8th century, the great monasteries of eastern India had a new set of patrons. The Pāla dynasty, which ruled Bengal and Bihar from roughly 750 to 1161. The Pālas were the last major Buddhist royal house in Indian history. Under Dharmapala, Nālandā received a grant of 200 villages, and 2 more enormous monastic universities were founded, Vikramashla and Somapura. Under his successor Devapala, the whole system reached its apex. Now notice what a village grant actually is. It is not a donation. A donation is a bag of rice that arrives once. A village grant is an income stream, the revenue of 200 settlements permanently assigned to an institution. The great Mahaviharas, the great monasteries, did not run on alms collected door to door. They ran on land. They had endowments, administrators, tenants, and account books. That is the hinge of this entire story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it sounds like good news, and it is not. An institution funded by land grants is an institution that no longer needs the person in the village. It has been freed from the daily transaction. The monk with the bowl, the family with the rice, the small conversation that happens between them every morning for 1,000 mornings. Financial security bought the monasteries their scholarship. It also bought them distance. This is the central argument of Lars Fogelin, whose archaeological history of Indian Buddhism is the standard modern treatment. Fogelin's position is that the decline was never a single event with a single cause. It was a process that ran for centuries, and the mechanism at the heart of it is exactly this. As the monastic community became economically self-sufficient, it was able to limit its day-to-day contact with ordinary lay people. That withdrawal, he argues, is what eventually brought the whole structure down. The historian Johannes Bronkhorst approaches it from a different direction and arrives somewhere compatible. Buddhism, he argues, was formidable in philosophical debate, but it could not compete with Brahmanism in the services it offered to political power. Kings needed ritual protection and practical counsel. Brahmins provided both professionally as a hereditary function. Buddhist monks, by vocation, largely did not, and beneath the level of kings, something quieter was happening that mattered more. The lay population of India was conservative in the most ordinary sense. People kept doing what they had always done: the household rites, the seasonal observances, the ceremonies around birth and marriage and death, while their nominal allegiance drifted, and those life cycle rituals belonged to Brahmanism. They were woven into caste, into village structure, into the calendar of the agricultural year. They did not require a monastery. They did not require a king's patronage. They did not depend on any dynasty at all. Put it as plainly as it deserves, Buddhism had universities. Brahmanism had weddings and funerals. One of those is far more fragile than it looks, which brings us to a man whose name comes up in almost every popular version of this story, usually in a role he did not play: Shankaracharya, Adi Shankara, the great systematizer of Advaita Vedanta. His dates are genuinely unsettled, and honesty requires giving you both. The traditional dating, upheld by the Sringeri monastery, he is said to have founded and accepted by earlier Western scholars like Max Müller, is roughly 788 to 820. Much of modern scholarship, following Hajime Nakamura and Karl Potter, places him earlier, around 700 to 750. The popular claim is that Shankara defeated Buddhism in debate and drove it out of India. That claim is not supported by the historical record. It needs to be said flatly because it is repeated constantly. Buddhism did not end with Shankara. Vikramasila, founded around the year 800, flourished for 4 centuries after him. The great Buddhist logicians Ratnakarashanti, Janashar, Mitra, Ratnakarti were still doing first-rate philosophical work into the 11th century. Anatisha, born in 982, taught at Vikramasila before traveling to Tibet and transmitting a tradition that is alive there today, that is 200 to 300 years of continued Buddhist intellectual life after the man who supposedly ended it. What Shankara actually did was compete, and he competed well. Advaita Vedanta made some of the same philosophical moves Buddhism had made. The analysis of self that turns out not to be what it appears. The claim that the world as ordinarily perceived is not the world as it is, but it made them inside a framework that kept the Vedas authoritative, the gods intact, and caste hierarchy in place. For a lay person, that combination was easier to hold. You could have the depth without leaving the world you already lived in. Rival Hindu philosophers noticed the resemblance, and they were not gentle about it. The charge that Shankara was a Prachana Buddha, a crypto-Buddhist, a Buddhist in disguise, came from other Vedantins, not from Buddhists. The earliest surviving version comes from Bhaskara, writing around 750 to 800, who described the illusionists as depending on Buddhist doctrine. Yamuna, Ramanuja, Madhva, Vallabha, and Vijnana Bhiksu all repeated some form of it over the following centuries. It was an insult traded inside the Hindu philosophical world. Modern scholarship registers a real influence without accepting the caricature. S.N. Dasgupta observed that Shankara's Brahman was very much like the Shunya of Nagarjuna. The Advaita tradition rejects the label, and it has the stronger argument on the decisive point. Advaita's Atman is an eternal, unchanging self, and an eternal, unchanging self is precisely what Anatta, the Buddhist teaching of not-self, denies. The resemblance is in the method, the disagreement is in the foundation, and it is total. So, not a conquest. A competitor offering an easier version of a difficult product to a population that was already leaning that way. There was one more absorption mechanism, and it was more elegant than argument. Somewhere in the middle of the first millennium, the Puranas, the great Hindu narrative compilations, began listing the Buddha among the avatars of Vishnu. He appears in the Agni, the Padma, the Garuda, the Linga, the Bhagavata. In the standard set of 10 incarnations, he is the 9th. On its surface, this looks like generous ecumenical embrace. Read the actual passages and it is considerably sharper than that. In several Puranic versions, the Buddha avatar exists in order to deceive. Vishnu takes the form of the Buddha to delude those who are hostile to proper devotion. Or, in another version, to lead the demons away from the Vedas so they can be defeated. The incarnation is a trap. The teaching is the bait. Scholars read the motive 2 ways, and both are worth having. Wendy Doniger has suggested it may be an attempt by orthodox Brahmanism to slander Buddhists by identifying them with demons. Helmuth von Glasenapp read it more benignly, as peaceful absorption, a way of winning Buddhists over to Vaishnavism without conflict. It is genuinely unresolved, and you can hold both possibilities at once. What is not disputed is the effect. For an ordinary Buddhist layperson in an Indian village, the boundary softened. Your devotion did not have to be abandoned. It could simply be folded in. The same reverence relocated inside a Vaishnava frame, with the Buddha now placed in a subordinate position in someone else's cosmology. And this needs a clear label on the screen. The Buddha as avatar doctrine is Hindu, from the Puranas. It is not, and never was, a Buddhist teaching. Ambedkar would reject it explicitly in public 800 years later. And we will get to that. So by the middle of the 12th century, here is the actual position. The monasteries are magnificent, wealthy, intellectually unmatched, and dependent on a single dynasty, physically concentrated in a handful of enormous sites, and increasingly disconnected from the villages around them. The lay base has been quietly draining for centuries. Then the Pālas fall. Their successors, the Senas, are Orthodox Hindus, and they redirect patronage accordingly. And then, around the year 1193, a Turkic commander named Bakhtiyar Khilji rides into Bihar with a couple of 100 horsemen. You know what happens next, or you think you do, because the story you know about what happened at Nālandā comes from a source written 400 years later in a different country, in which the fire is a miracle. Chapter 2. Before we walk into the year 1193, one thing needs saying, because everything after it depends on it. This is not a story with villains in it. It is very easy, and in certain quarters, very popular, to tell the disappearance of Indian Buddhism as a crime with a perpetrator. Pick your culprit: the Brahmins, the Muslims. Both versions get told loudly, and both of them are doing political work in the present, rather than historical work about the past. What the evidence actually supports is less satisfying and considerably more interesting. A tradition lost the conditions that had kept it alive: patronage, lay connection, physical distribution, across several centuries. And then, at the very end, force arrived and finished something that was already nearly finished. The force was real. It was also late. Hold both of those at once. Neither one cancels the other, and anyone who asks you to drop one of them is selling something. So, the Pālas. Around the year 1161, the last great Buddhist royal house of India finally gave out. The Senas who replaced them in Bengal were Orthodox Hindus, and they redirected patronage accordingly toward Brahmanical temples and Brahmin grantees. Now recall what we established about how the monasteries were funded, and notice what a change of dynasty actually means. If your institution runs on assigned village revenue, A new royal house is not a political inconvenience. It is a funding cliff. And there was a second thing the Pālas had provided, which is easy to overlook until it matters: protection. The great monasteries were enormously wealthy, physically concentrated, sitting in open plain, and undefended. Monks do not garrison walls. Then, in the 1190s, the Ghurid expansion pushed east across northern India. One of its commanders, a Turkic officer named Bakhtiyar Khilji, operated in Bihar somewhere between 1193 and 1200. You already know what happens next, or you think you do, so let's do the thing the popular version never does. Let's go read the source. There is essentially one account of this event written anywhere near the time it happened: the Tabaqat-i Nasiri, a Persian chronicle composed around 1260 by Minhaji Siraj Juzjani. Roughly 60 years after the fact, from the testimony of men who claim to have been there. Here is what it describes: an attack on a fortified place. The place is called Bihar. Around 200 horsemen. Inside, men with shaved heads, Buddhist monks, killed. And a great quantity of books, which no one present could read, because by then, there was no one left alive to explain them. Now read that again, and notice what is not in it. It does not say Nalanda. The name Nalanda does not appear anywhere in the passage. A number of historians, Jadunath Sarkar among the earlier ones, identify the fortified Bihar of the chronicle as Odantapur, a different monastery a few miles off, one that genuinely was fortified. The historian D.N. Jha puts it about as bluntly as a historian can. Minhaj does not refer to Nalanda at all. And the burning libraries? The image everyone carries: smoke over Bihar for 3 months. That is not in the Persian chronicle either. The 3-month fire enters this story through Tibetan historical writing. Taranatha, in the 17th century. The Pagsam Xuanzang of Sumpakanpo, in the 18th, 400 and 500 years after the event, in a different country, in a different language. And in those accounts, the fire is not a military act at all. It is a miracle. Angry non-Buddhist ascetics perform an act of supernatural vengeance, and the libraries burn. So here is the line, and it belongs on the screen exactly as it stands. The raid was real. The 3-month burning is legend. That is not a defense of anyone. 200 horsemen killed unarmed men in a monastery, and the chronicle that records it was written by people who considered the day a success. The correction is narrower than that, and more unsettling. When we reach for the one image that supposedly explains a 600-year disappearance, we are reaching for a 17th century miracle story, which raises a question nobody usually asks. If the Great Raid did not end Buddhism in India, what did the aftermath actually look like? We have an answer, and it is one of the quietest, saddest documents in this entire history. Around 1234 or 1235, some 40 years after the raid, a Tibetan pilgrim named Dharmasvamin made the journey to Nālandā. He had come for what pilgrims had always come for: texts and teachers. He found ruins. The site was largely damaged and largely deserted. He also found 70 students, still there, still studying, under a teacher named Rahula Shribhadra, who was about 90 years old and who was being supported by a local ruler and by a Brahmin layman named Jayadeva, which is worth stopping on for a second, given everything we've just said about competing traditions. A Brahmin householder was keeping the last teacher at Nālandā fed, and Dharmasvamin found no books, not a reduced library, no library. He could not obtain a single manuscript to copy. He had crossed the Himalayas for texts, and the texts were gone. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is the exact shape of this entire story in miniature. 40 years after the supposed annihilation, the teaching had not stopped. 70 students and one very old man working in the rubble. It had not been destroyed. It was almost over. Those are different things, and the difference is 600 years long. The other great monasteries went in the same window. Vikramashila, destroyed in the same campaigns around 1200. Odantapur, taken and turned into a garrison for the new rulers, the fortification that had probably made it a target in the first place. Somapura, Jagadala, and here the concentration that had been Buddhism's institutional strength became its fatal design flaw. Take out 4 or 5 sites in northeastern India, and you have taken out, simultaneously, the libraries, the senior faculty, the ordination lineages, and the entire training system of a subcontinent. Brahmanism could not be destroyed this way, because there was nothing to destroy. It lived in 10,000 villages, in households, in a hereditary priesthood that needed no campus at all. A word on where scholars actually stand, because this is contested ground and you deserve to know the shape of the argument, rather than one confident version of it. The mainstream position is multi-causal and gradual. Lars Fogelin and Johannes Bronkhorst, whom we've already met. Richard Eaton, whose work on temple desecration shows it was politically targeted rather than indiscriminate. Romila Thapa on the political economy of patronage. Richard Gombrich. There are also serious minority positions, and they should be named as minority positions. Giovanni Verardi argues for structural Brahminical violence as the primary driver. Reviewers treat his book as important and contest its central claim. Audrey Trushke argues that scholars have overstated the role of Muslim violence. Fogelin partly accepts her critique, while maintaining that Turkic violence had real effects in 13th century northeastern India. D.N. Jha argues that the Nalanda destruction narrative has been politically instrumentalized in modern India. We are reporting the range. We are not picking a winner, and we are not going to editorialize about present-day Indian politics. That is not what tonight is. And keep holding what we said early. In Ladakh, in Sikkim, in Arunachal, among the Baruas of Bengal, none of this happened. Buddhism there simply continued and continues now. Here is the turn, and it is the reason this story is not finally a tragedy. Almost nothing was actually lost. Sri Lanka, at Aluvihara, in the 1st century before the Common Era, during famine and foreign invasion, monks made a decision that must have felt like an admission of defeat. They wrote the canon down, because they were afraid the men who had memorized it were going to die. What they produced is the only complete early Buddhist canon surviving in an Indian language. China, Kumarajiva's Translation Bureau. Xuanzang, who walked home from Nālandā with 657 texts and spent the rest of his life translating them. Yijing, with roughly 400 more. Tibet, the Kangyur and the Tengyur, a translation project of a scale Europe has no equivalent to. And here is the detail that closes the loop. A great deal of the material we have from Asanga, from Vasubandhu, from Dharmakirti, much of the deepest philosophical work Nālandā ever produced, survives only in translation. The Sanskrit originals are gone. What exists is Chinese and Tibetan. So when the libraries of Bihar burned, or were looted, or simply rotted after the last man who could read them died, the material had already been carried out, copied, argued over, and preserved in other languages, in other countries, for 1,000 years. Ashoka, 3rd century before the Common Era, he gave it away, which leaves one question, and it is the one that turns this from history into something closer to home. The Dhamma survived everywhere except the place it came from. Could it come back? It did, in the autumn of 1956. And the man who brought it back had spent the first part of his life being told he was too impure to drink from the village well. Chapter 3. Now let's go back to that conversation I left open at the very beginning. Mahakassapa comes to the Buddha with a question. Once, he says, there were fewer training rules and more monks who actually reached awakening. Now there are more rules and fewer who get there. Why? Uwanmi 16:13. If you were designing the answer, you would probably reach for something external. Hostile kings, rival teachers, hard times. The Buddha does not go there. Not once. He says the true Dhamma does not disappear while it stands alone. It disappears when a counterfeit of it arises. Sadhamma, patirupaka, a look-alike. Something that resembles the teaching closely enough to be mistaken for it. He compares it to gold. Counterfeit gold does not appear in a world that has no gold. It appears alongside the real thing, and then the real thing becomes impossible to identify. And who produces the counterfeit? In Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation, the Buddha's answer is startlingly direct. It's worthless people who arise right here who make the true Dhamma disappear. Right here, inside, not out there. He then names 5 conditions, and every one of them is a form of disrespect held by the community itself, toward the teacher, toward the teaching, toward the Sangha, toward the training, toward concentration. Now hold that next to the 600 years we just walked through. A tradition whose institutions grew wealthy and drew back from the people who fed them. A tradition that stopped being able to explain itself to the village while it was writing extraordinary philosophy for a few thousand specialists. A tradition whose survival came to depend on the goodwill of a dynasty, and ended when that dynasty ended. Nothing in that list is an army. There is a companion discourse that makes the mechanism even more concrete. And 5.156 gives 5 things that lead to the decline of the true teaching. The discourse is memorized wrong, so the meaning goes wrong. A community that becomes hard to correct, impatient with instruction. Senior teachers who fail to make the next generation recite, so that when they die, the texts are, in the sutta's phrase, cut off at the root. Senior monastics who become indulgent and slack, and juniors who copy them. And schism, the community splitting and turning on itself, cut off at the root. Read Dharmasvamin's account again. 70 students, one 90-year-old teacher, no manuscripts, and tell me that is not a description of exactly that. But the same discourse does something the popular idea of Buddhist decline almost never does. It gives the mirror. 5 conditions under which the teaching continues. Texts carried accurately, a community willing to be corrected, elders who make sure others can recite what they know, seniors who keep practicing rather than coasting, and a Sangha that lives in harmony without splitting. That is not a prophecy of doom. It is a maintenance schedule. And in the Mahaparinibbana discourse, Diyen 16, the Buddha describes what the tradition is supposed to rest on. 4 assemblies, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, all 4 of them accomplished, learned, and able to preserve and explain and defend the teaching. 4 legs. India kept the monastic legs magnificently for as long as the money held. The lay legs thinned for centuries before anyone noticed. Sri Lanka, Tibet, and East Asia kept all 4. One thing to flag before we move, because it gets quoted constantly as though the Buddha said it. The famous scheme of 5 disappearances, attainment, then practice, then learning, then the monastic robes themselves, then finally the relics, is not in the suttas. It comes from Buddhaghosa's commentaries, roughly the 5th century of the Common Era, and was gathered up later in medieval compilations. It is 1,000 years downstream of the canon. The suttas themselves stay stubbornly human. The causes of decline are things people do, which is either the bleakest possible reading of this history or the most hopeful one. Because if decline is something people do, then so is the other thing. In 1956, someone did the other thing. His name was Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, and he was born in 1891 into the Maha caste, untouchable in the vocabulary of the time. As a schoolboy, he was made to sit apart from the other children on a piece of sacking he had to carry in and out himself, because the classroom floor could not be polluted by contact with him. He was not allowed to touch the water vessel either. A higher caste school servant had to pour water for him from a height, and if that man wasn't there, he went without. Ambedkar's own summary of the arrangement was 4 words: no paean, no water. That boy went on to take a doctorate in economics from Columbia University in New York, then a doctorate of science from the London School of Economics. He was called to the bar at Gray's Inn. When India became independent, he chaired the drafting committee of its constitution, the document that wrote the abolition of untouchability into the law of the Republic, and served as its first law minister, until he resigned in 1951 over the government's failure to pass reform of Hindu personal law. And for roughly 20 years before that, he had been saying in public that he had been born a Hindu, but would not die one. He looked seriously at several traditions. What he settled on was Buddhism, and his reasoning was not sentimental. Buddhism was indigenous to India. No one could call it foreign. And of all the traditions born on that soil, it was the one that had refused caste at the level of metaphysics, rather than merely deploring it at the level of manners. There is no cosmic order in the suttas that makes one birth pure and another polluted. On the 14th of October 1956, in a field in Nagpur, Ambedkar and his wife Savita knelt before Bhadant-u Chandramani, the senior-most Buddhist monk in India, originally from Burma, and took the 3 refugees and the 5 precepts. And then Ambedkar stood up, turned around, and administered them to the crowd. Take a moment with that gesture, because it is the same gesture Ashoka made 2,200 years earlier. At the other end of this story, he received it and immediately gave it away. He also gave the crowd 22 vows of his own composition. Some renounce the Hindu deities, some are ethical commitments, and one of them reaches back and takes hold of something we looked at an hour ago, the doctrine that the Buddha was the 9th avatar of Vishnu. Ambedkar rejects it explicitly in public, in front of hundreds of thousands of people, and calls the claim sheer madness and false propaganda. 800 years after the Puranic absorption, somebody stood in a field and undid it out loud. Roughly 365,000 people converted with him that day. In the weeks and the years that followed, the numbers ran into the hundreds of thousands and then into the millions. 6 weeks later, on the 6th of December, Ambedkar was dead. He left behind a book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, finished that year and published after his death. And honesty requires being clear about what kind of book it is. It is a reconstruction, not a traditional presentation. Ambedkar set aside karma as fate and literal rebirth as superstition. He recast dukkha as suffering that is socially produced, poverty, humiliation, exclusion, rather than primarily existential. He questioned traditional narratives, including the story of the 4 sites. He called what he was building by his own name for it. Our Buddha Dhamma is a new Buddha Dhamma, Navayana. The new vehicle is Navayana Buddhism, That question is genuinely contested, and I am not going to settle it for you because it isn't mine to settle. Some traditional Buddhists regard the removal of karma, rebirth, renunciation, and nibbana as traditionally understood to be a distortion serious enough to break the connection. Others regard it as a legitimate modern adaptation, socially engaged Buddhism in a country where the social was precisely the problem. Both positions are held by serious people. You can carry the question with you. What is not in question is the demographic result. In the 2011 census, India counted 8,442,972 Buddhists, 0.7% of the population. In 1951, before Ambedkar, the figure was about 180,000. By 1961, it had passed 3.25 million. That jump is him. Around 87% of India's Buddhists today are Ambedkarite. About 77% of them live in one state, Maharashtra. Buddhist leaders there argue the real number is closer to 10 or 12 million, and that some converts register as Hindu in order to keep the reservation benefits attached to scheduled caste status. A claim worth reporting as a claim, not as a corrected figure. And beside them, unrelated to any of this, are the communities that were never part of the vanishing at all. Sikkim, where more than a quarter of the population is Buddhist. Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, the Baruas of Bengal, over 1 million of them, who simply never stopped. Two Buddhisms then, in modern India. One that never left, up in the hills and along the eastern coast, and one that came back down onto the plain in a field in Nagpur, carried by people who had been told for 3,000 years that they were too impure to enter the building. Closely. Let's go back to where we started tonight, which is also where the whole thing started. 3rd century before the Common Era. An emperor with the largest army on the subcontinent looks at a teaching he has just adopted, and instead of building it a fortress, he puts it on the road. Sri Lanka, the Northwest, Central Asia, outward. At the time, that must have looked like generosity, or diplomacy, or vanity, depending on whom you asked. What it actually was, and nobody alive could possibly have known this, was a backup. 800 years later, everything Ashoka sent out is what survived. The canon that Sri Lankan monks wrote down in a cave during a famine because they were afraid the men who had memorized it would starve. The Chinese libraries that Xuanzang spent the rest of his life filling after he walked home from Nālandā. The Tibetan translations of books whose Sanskrit originals no longer exist anywhere on earth. The Dhamma survived because it had been given away. Now hold that against the other half of tonight. What failed in India was the part that was held inside a handful of enormous institutions, held up by an endowment, held by a professional class that became more brilliant and more distant at precisely the same rate. Every single thing that felt like strength, the wealth, the concentration, the scholarly depth, the favor of kings, turned out to be the fragile part. And the thing that must have felt closest to loss, sending your best people to foreign countries you would never see them return from, turned out to be the part that lasted. That is not a lesson about Buddhism. That's the uncomfortable bit. That's a lesson about anything worth keeping. There's a shape in the suttas that fits this exactly. When the Buddha describes how a person actually develops, the gradual training, each step making the next one possible, it never happens in isolation. It needs a teacher who can be questioned. It needs text transmitted accurately enough to be trusted. It needs other people doing the same work. And it needs ordinary households supporting the whole arrangement for reasons that are mostly not philosophical at all. pull one leg out and the structure does not collapse dramatically. It just quietly stops producing what it used to produce. That is what India looked like from the inside for 600 years. Not a catastrophe, a slow subtraction. And by the time anyone could see the shape of it, the only people left who could have described what was missing were 70 students in a ruin, sitting with a 90-year-old man. Here is where I think this stops being history. Most of us, past a certain point in life, are carrying something we would like to outlast us. It might be a craft, a body of knowledge, a way of doing a particular thing properly that fewer and fewer people now do properly. It might be a faith. It might be something as ordinary and as serious as the specific way your family handles a crisis. And the instinct, it's a strong one, and it comes from real love for the thing, is to hold it. Keep it correct. Keep it yours. The suttas suggest that instinct is close to backwards. What preserves something is not custody. And 5.156, transmit it accurately. Stay correctable. The suttas phrase for the failure mode is being hard to admonish, impatient, unwilling to take instruction respectfully, which is an unnervingly precise description of what happens to expertise as it ages. Make other people say it back to you, out loud, while you are still here to correct them. Because whatever you do, not hand over gets cut off at the root the day you stop. Keep practicing yourself, because the people coming after you copy what you do and not what you tell them. And do not let the thing split into factions that spend their strength on each other. 5 items. Not one of them is about defending against an enemy, which is exactly what the Buddha said to Mahakassapa 25 centuries ago, and what the Indian record confirms with a thoroughness that is almost eerie. He was asked why a tradition declines, and he never once looked outside the room. Counterfeit gold arises right here. The decay comes from what people do, which means it is not weather and it is not fate. It is a set of things done or left undone by particular human beings across particular decades. That is a heavier account than an army came. It is also a far more hopeful one, because if decline is something people do, then so is continuation. Ashoka gave it away, and it survived everywhere except home. And then, on the 14th of October, 1956, in a field in Nagpur, a man who had once been made to sit outside the classroom on a sack he carried home every night, because the floor could not be touched by him, knelt down, took the refuges, stood back up, and gave them to 365,000 people, vanished from the heartland where it was born, and then not vanished.